Medieval weapons are fascinating. They pose so many questions about the world in which they were used. How were they made? How do you fight with them? What are they capable of? And most of all, what did they mean to the people who used them? To our medieval ancestors, weapons were of immense personal value. They were treasures, often of great beauty, and the companions of a man in his most desperate hour of need. In this episode, I'm going to explore the weapon perhaps most associated with the medieval period, the sword. From the gentlemanly art of dueling to the swash and swagger of the silver screen, the sword is at the heart of our romantic imaginations. It's the weapon with which the hero wins out against insuperable odds. It is the weapon that gives the hope that skill can triumph over brute force. But on the battlefield, the sword is a vicious and visceral weapon, capable of a savage and chilling brutality. And there is one late medieval battle in which it played a remarkably central role. Here, over 500 years ago, on Easter Sunday, 1471, 24,000 soldiers fought desperately for over 3 hours in a brutal struggle. It was the Battle of Barnet, and much of the fighting was close quarter, hand-to-hand combat, and the sword was a principal weapon. Then, Barnet was just a village 11 miles north of London. But the battle there marked a turning point in the Wars of the Roses and saw the death of the most powerful man in England. Although firmly in the age when most battles were decided by gunpowder and arrow storms, at Barnet the men had to fall back on the age-old skills of fighting with the sword. And here we have a typical sword of the period. It's double-edged, fairly rigid, and it has a sharp point. It's the sort of sword that can be used both for the cut and for the thrust. It's got a pommel at one end. This is a weight. It counterbalances the sword. It helps it get over that initial inertia, so the sword can be wielded with fluidity and speed. Now, swords like this were in general use both by cavalry and infantry. But at Barnet, there was another type of sword prevalent on the battlefield. It was the long sword. It's the king of swords. This is a sword which has tremendous power and versatility in the frenzy of close-quarter combat. And the most important thing about any sword is the blade. And it seems straightforward, but actually it's a very sophisticated piece of technology. The steel must be hard enough so that it will take an edge. But if it's too hard, it'll be brittle and break. And swords did break, and that's the last thing you need in battle, is for your sword to break. So you need a good quality sword that also has flexibility, pliability. It must be a spring. It must be tempered, just so. To explore the way swords would have been used in a conflict like Barnet, I've brought 10 students along for a crash course in 15th century techniques. Similar schools existed throughout the Middle Ages, teaching fighting methods essential for survival on the battlefield. Good morning, guys. This is called the long sword, sometimes called the hand-and-a-half sword or the bastard sword, but we're going to call it the long sword. First thing you need to get a look at is the sort of guards you might take. So if you want to each take a sword, you'll see they're wooden, but actually that's completely authentic. They were known as wasters. First position I want you to take is called the plough. We begin with basic stances, known as guards. These provide the most efficient positions from which attacks can both be launched and defended. Then what I can do is set it aside, so I set it aside with a beat. Precision is the key word. Really use the fulcrum of the hilt and cut down from the roof and go into ox. Again, from ox. Obviously we can thrust. Don't take it too wide because you become exposed. Take it very tight. When you're fighting in a battle, it's happening 360 degrees around you. It's just not front on. The guards are then combined into a drill. From the roof. This programs the muscle memory into automatically making the transition from one position to the next. All moves must become instinctive. There was no time to stop and think at the Battle of Barnet. The Wars of the Roses lasted on and off for 30 years, though there were less than 12 weeks of actual fighting. This mafia-like struggle saw mighty barons allied to the houses of York and Lancaster fighting to control the crown. Chief among them was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. His vast landowning wealth, centered on Warwick Castle, made him the most powerful man in the land. He sided with this man, Edward of York, and deposed the Lancastrian king, Henry VI. Warwick was the driving force behind the coup. But 9 years into Edward's reign, Warwick, who had quarrelled with him, raised an army and drove him into exile. Warwick had changed sides. He was now a Lancastrian. And so here we begin the second phase of the Wars of the Roses. And this is where we are now. Edward has come back. In 1471, he comes back with a great invasion force to reclaim his crown. And now both armies are mustering their forces in the Midlands, each waiting for the other to make the first move. It's a cat and mouse game. But Edward takes the initiative. Edward decides to strike for London. 6 days later, he enters the capital in triumph and is crowned once more. Warwick follows. He reaches Dunstable on Good Friday, where he learns the capital is lost. By the next morning, he's half a mile north of Barnet and commands his army to take up positions on a ridge of high ground. And here they wait for the onset of a battle that will decide the fate of both Edward and Warwick. Okay, so now let's put some of those guards into action. At the sword school, the students are getting to grips with basic techniques. I'm going to step back, setting aside. By the end of today, they must be good enough to take part in a simulated battle scene, in which they will need lightning reactions and heightened spatial awareness as the mayhem swirls around them. Now, his hands, and come back with the pommel.
It is a danger, but as long as you maintain eye contact with your partner in terms of the training, then you always know what's coming next. Sometimes you get a few knocks and bruises, but it's just part of the process. You make sure you don't get hit again. You know what I mean? You make sure you keep eye contact.
The end move's a bit tricky. I've got a feeling I'm going to get smacked in the face with this at some point today.
Get rid of your sword, and you must catch that. Yes.
I will.
Warwick's soldiers, waiting on the ridge at Barnet, little realised that skill with the sword would soon determine their fate. It's Easter Saturday, 1471. The sword is about to take centre stage in one of the most critical battles of the Wars of the Roses. The Earl of Warwick has stationed his Lancastrian forces on high ground half a mile north of Barnet. They now wait for the enemy to arrive. At 4 o'clock, the Yorkist Edward IV begins the march north from London. He makes good progress and reaches Barnet by dusk. Despite the gathering darkness, Edward decides not to allow his troops to stay in the village, probably so they don't succumb to the temptations of the taverns. Instead, he orders them to approach very quietly towards Warwick's forces, who are stationed somewhere just over there on the high ground, and get themselves into position in front of his lines. Now, this night maneuver doesn't go exactly according to plan, because it's now so dark that Edward's men can't see clearly. And they come much, much closer than they realise to Warwick's army, bang in front of his formidable artillery. Cannon had been a common sight on the battlefield for over a century, and Warwick is an enthusiastic user of it. Today, his artillery considerably outnumbers Edward's. So why were swords still being carried in the age of the gun? In part, it was because of the sword's iconic status, a legacy from its past. In Anglo-Saxon Britain, the sword was the most celebrated weapon on the battlefield, renowned not just for its brutal efficiency, but for magical properties it was thought to possess. Perhaps the most famous enchanted sword is Excalibur, which has since become a potent symbol of power, status, and authority. Much of the sword's elevated status stemmed from the intricate manner in which early swords were made. Swordsmith Hector Cole is going to make us an Anglo-Saxon sword, revealing the secrets of ancient techniques. Techniques which ensured the blade embodied the key qualities of toughness and flexibility. If we take the toughness, then if you've ever handled a piece of modern tool steel, like a file, then you'll know how hard and tough that is as a material that can really take a sharp edge, like a razor blade. Problem with it is, it's quite a brittle material. If we take a piece of iron, then that's iron, the raw material iron, then it's a soft material. If I hit somebody hard with it, it will bend. Trouble is, it will stay in that bend. So that is clearly not a very useful shape for a weapon. Saxon swordsmiths employed an ingenious solution. The properties of both iron and steel were forged together in the same blade.
The Saxon steel was totally unpredictable. You couldn't guarantee whether it was going to have a lot of carbon in it or very little carbon in it. So, by putting the two together, you equaled out those...
Insurance policy.
That's it.
Alternate bars of iron and steel are arranged in a bundle, then welded together. This bar is then twisted into a spiral, and these spirals, when reheated and flattened, form the flexible central core of the blade. Steel cutting edges are welded separately to the central core. The whole process is extremely time-consuming, and our sword takes Hector several weeks. The final stage is to etch the blade with acid. This brings out the elaborate pattern created by the spirals of iron and steel. Yeah, it's coming to life. Almost as if you're breathing life into the sword. It's like you can now see the veins and arteries.
That's right.
The living thing.
How about that?
Look at that for a pattern. It's glorious. It's these patterns that give the process its name, pattern welding. Pattern welded swords were weapons of high prestige, affordable only to the military elite. They became prized heirlooms, handed down through generations of warriors, each hoping to immortalize his name through military prowess. In the epic poem Beowulf, the hero is lent a pattern-welded sword before facing the ferocious sea monster, Grendel's mother.
Hrunting was the name of that hefted sword. It was one famous among ancient treasures. The blade was of iron, poison twig patterned. Battle blood hardened, never did it fail any man at war who grasped it in his hands.
For centuries, pattern welding was the only way to make strong and reliable swords. But by the turn of the first millennium, all that had changed. Dramatic improvements to the way iron was produced meant that blades could now be forged from a single piece. They could now be manufactured in greater numbers. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, swords were a general issue weapon, routinely taken into battle. Yet the legacy of their Anglo-Saxon past lived on. The power of the sword remained, no longer the ultimate symbol of the Saxon warrior, but instead of the medieval knight. And to all the ancient traditions of power, status, and authority was added the final touch of Christian sanctity. In the Crusades, knights and warrior monks like the Knights Templar were exhorted by the Pope to turn their swords on the enemies of Christ, with the promise that their past sins would be forgiven. By the Battle of Barnet in 1471, although increasingly commonplace, swords retained their status above other weapons, their prestige and symbolism undiminished. Housed in the Kelvin Grove Museum in Glasgow is an exceptionally fine sword. Though dating to the century before Barnet, it is similar to the longswords of Warwick and Edward's men. This is probably my favourite sword in the world. It's from about 1370, it's probably Italian. And I mean, I've handled literally dozens of medieval swords originals in museums and private collections, but nothing gives me quite the same thrill as handling this one. It's in the most extraordinary state of preservation. It has its original wooden grip, that's very rare. And it has this feature here. It's called a rain guard. What it's for protecting the blade when the sword is in the scabbard, protecting it from moisture or rust. It tells us that somebody really cared about this sword. It was a prized and valued personal possession. It's dawn on Easter Sunday, 1471. For the first time, armies commanded by Warwick and Edward are about to fight. It's make or break in the Wars of the Roses. Yet at this stage, it doesn't look like it's the sword that's going to decide the battle. Warwick has got a considerable train of artillery, which he's deployed on the high ground just a little way behind me here. And in the darkness, Edward has brought his troops forward to about here. Much closer than either side realizes. In fact, they're so close, it's said that Edward's Yorkist men could hear the voices of Warwick's soldiers in the darkness. And so Edward told his men to stay quiet. Now, Warwick was eager to capitalize on this superiority of artillery, so he commences a great night's bombardment. All night long there is the deafening crack of cannon as they belch their sulphurous fury into the night sky. But because the armies are so close, much closer than Warwick could ever have expected or assumed, the cannon are overshooting. So Edward, not wanting him to realize his mistake, tells his men, stay quiet, hold your breath, remain silent. And that they do all night. And the Yorkist soldiers are unharmed. Warwick's plan was further confounded as a heavy, impenetrable mist began to form. This was to have a major impact on the battle to come. The gunpowder smoke from the continuous artillery fire condensed with the mist to create a thick fog, like the pea soupers that Londoners were later to experience in the industrial age. Most knights dismounted to fight on foot, and both longbows and guns were virtually redundant, as no one could see who they were shooting at. This was a slugging match, raw, hand-to-hand combat, and for every man on that field, skill with the sword was paramount. We still struggle to understand exactly what went on in a medieval battle, but we do have remarkable manuscript evidence of the fighting techniques used. The at Kelvin Grove Museum as the finest collection of medieval fight manuals in the world. They're a rich resource for curator Tobias Capwell.
Obviously, you pick any random page, any random book, and you find yourself looking at...
I love this one in particular because you could see here down the side where it's actually, you could see on the doublet and the hose, it's got A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H.
Yeah.
And that's telling you this is very systemized. This is an organized system, a codified way of learning.
But that you had to come to the teacher to learn it, that the book is really only an aid to study, and that sword fighting is a very physical, very personal thing.
Sadly, no English fight manuals survive from this time. But a German fight master, Hans Talhofer, was busy publishing his techniques at exactly the same period as the Battle of Barnet. It's originally in Swabian German. Teaching at the court of Count Eberhard the Bearded, his wonderful legacy survives. But it doesn't really tell you how to do it.
No.
Just gives that tantalizing clue. Despite the cryptic nature of the text, the superlative quality of Talhofer's illustrations allow his techniques to be interpreted with reasonable accuracy. The use of the foot here is very telling. But Talhofer doesn't restrict himself just to the longsword. And it's clear that closing in, wrestling and grappling, disarming an opponent and defeating him in any way possible are as much a part of his system as is attacking and defending with the blade. So you may think that having been disarmed of my sword, I'm pretty helpless now. But again, if we look at Talhofer, if we look at the pictures, you can see he gives lots of remedies for a man without a weapon to defeat a man with a weapon. So if my cello were to thrust at my face, for instance, I can simply sidestep, use my forearm to block on his forearms. Just push his sword away, come down, get my shoulder on his waist, and hop! And then we've got rid of him. Everybody game to have a go at that? He's cutting down at the left side of my neck. I step in with my right, blocking their forearms, pushing that sword over, coming down to get your left shoulder into the waist. Okay, then if you just want to support the weight, don't throw yet, just pick each other up. Okay, then. Right, so you're going to hurt your back, Mon. Excellent. You're coming down at my neck. I step in. There, and go. And preferably don't land on your sword. Many of the soldiers at the Battle of Barnet were also equipped with plate armor, which can turn a blade or stop a point. So how do you overcome an opponent with a sword when his armor is proof against it? Easter Sunday, 1471, and the Battle of Barnet is underway. Gunsmoke from earlier artillery fire has mixed with the mist to create a thick fog. Cannons and bows are now almost redundant as the men can't see to take aim. The battle becomes a desperate hand-to-hand encounter, a strenuous, bruising struggle in which the sword takes center stage. The majority of men on the field are hardened professional soldiers, rugged and violent men. Until recently, they'd been in France, serving in the 100 Years' War. But the English had finally been defeated. Great armies of unemployed soldiers returned home. For generations, they had been recruited for the war by the feudal landowners. And now, bored with the humdrum life of peace, they again sought service in one of the private armies still maintained by the leading barons. The system was called livery and maintenance. A soldier would wear the badge and livery coat of his lord and maintain him in his quarrels in return for his protection in theirs. These were turbulent and dissatisfied times. Justice was virtually non-existent. And these were the men, the livery and maintenance men, who fought and died in their master's shifting causes, in the vendettas and campaigns of the Wars of the Roses. As well as foot soldiers, these private armies also included high-status knights and their war horses. The Battle of Barnet, most knights dismounted to fight on foot, although some did still fight on their horses. And of course, being able to use the sword on horseback is an essential skill for all knights. And again, Hans Talhofer gives us plenty of clues as to how it was done. I'm going to explore some of his techniques with an old sparring partner, John Thompson. One of the first things to consider is how do you actually close with another knight? If we go hell for leather for each other, ha! It's only one blow and you're past each other before you can deliver any sequence of blows. Of course, when you're on a horse, you've got plenty of ability to move, but you don't have the same ability to move as you do when you're on your feet. However, you still can avoid a blow. I'm going to come in and cut down at your head, John. I can avoid like that, and John, hopefully on a good day, will be able to avoid that. So you can avoid blows either by leaning back or leaning forward.
There's an excellent illustration which is over here, where I take your sword.
You can take my sword?
I'll show you how to do that.
Oh, really?
And if Mike was to ride at me, the thrust, and I, very subtly, I'm just going to put my sword into this hand holding the cross guard as he comes, and he won't know what I'm doing here. I move to the side, and I take his sword.
Then
I don't need that.
Disarmed. However, I'm not helpless being disarmed, because we've got another wonderful illustration from Talhofer. I could get after him, come alongside, and I have got a disarm here. So again, I get my sword back. I can renew my attack onto John. And again, we fall into wrestling moves and classic Talhofer wrestling. At Barnet, Warwick is persuaded by his brother to dismount and fight on foot, to show his men that he is not for turning, that he will stand or die by their side, whatever the day may bring. Hours later, his bold undertaking is held to account. As the fighting continues, it becomes clear the opposing armies are misaligned. Warwick's right outflanks and outnumbers Edward's left, and the Yorkist division soon flee the battlefield, spreading the news that the day belongs to Warwick. On Edward's right flank, the roles are reversed. His men beat back Warwick's left, causing the whole position of the battle to swing round like a rugby scrum. Edward was in the thick of the fighting and reported to have acquitted himself with courage and skill.
With great violence he beat and bore down before him all that stood in his way. And turning first one way and then another, he so beat and bore down that nothing might stand in the sight of him.
He so beat and bore down. Now these words hold an important clue about the nature of the fighting at Barnet. Contemporary illustrations show soldiers in full plate armor. And even though not everyone would have the full kit, most were well equipped. And against such defenses, what use is a sword? One 13th century manuscript depicts swords cutting through armor. The Majowski Bible was illustrated 200 years before the Battle of Barnet, and it shows steel helmets being cleft, causing horrific injury. Emrys, good morning.
Hey, Mike.
I've come to the workshop of medieval armourer Emrys to find out if there could be any truth in such depictions. You know, we read in the sagas of helms being cleaved and all that.
Yes.
And you will be familiar with this, Majowski Bible.
Oh, I know it well.
And we see the helms being cleaved by swords. Does this ring true to you?
No, of course not.
But we will try and drop it in there and see if we can do at least some damage.
Well, you'll damage the sword.
But you're happy to risk.
No competition, really, is there?
Let us see. I doubt that the sword will cut through the helm, but I'm keen to see to what extent it will bite into the steel, thus transferring the force of the blow to the man within. It's made. It's bitten into the metal. The injuries shown in the Majowski Bible seem far-fetched, but such a blow is likely to have left the man dazed and concussed. And that was very much the function of the sword at Barnet. Sharp enough to bite into metal and heavy enough for blows to be felt through the armour. It was at the very least a powerful bludgeoning tool. From as early as 1250, sword makers had responded to changes in armour by creating a variety of designs. But is there such a thing as an optimum sword? To find out, I've come to the Royal Military College of Science at Shrivenham, a national centre for the assessment and testing of weapons. What I have here is a range of different swords that have been especially made for me in order to do some tests. They're very, very beautifully made. And very sharp. Now, this one is typical of the sort of sword used by the Saxons and the Vikings and the early Normans. In other words, the sword didn't really change in design much from the 7th to the mid-13th centuries. It's broad-bladed, it's about 31 inches in length, and it has this central fuller, this groove down the middle, which, rather like corrugated iron, gives it both rigidity and strength and lightness. Now, once we start to get this proliferation of sword design, this diversity in the mid-13th century, one of the first things was to go for bigger swords. And here we've got a classic war sword, a weapon of mighty power. Let's see how that performs. And in this other box, we have two other swords, one of which is a falchion. Look at that, isn't it beautiful? And the shape is very much the key. It's got a curved blade. So the idea is that as it cuts, it imparts a slicing motion to the wound. And this last is a 15th century sword. They're really looking to get the optimum sword, a sword that will both cut and thrust. So there's a lot of focus on the thrust, this very, very narrow, needle-sharp point, strengthened by this high ridge. No longer the groove, no longer the fuller, but now it's hollow ground here to give this ridge. So it's a very stiff sword for thrusting. A high-speed camera captures the extraordinary degree of bend that a sword incurs under stress, highlighting the importance of its flexibility. First, I use a thrusting action. A block of clay provides my blows with a consistent target. Next, I see how my four swords perform using a cutting action. Again, the essential quality of flexibility in a blade is clear. Swords mustn't break in battle. Swords weren't designed to attack clay. They were designed to attack and mutilate the human body. They were designed to attack and defeat armor. But what the clay gave us was a consistent material so we could measure the relative properties of these different blade designs. And what is clear is that the war sword is better both at the cut and at the thrust. Pretty much as we'd expect. It's a heavier iron bar. I can give a more powerful cut. I can deliver a more powerful thrust. But very close to that was the falchion in the cut. Again, pretty much as I expected. Because of its purpose-built curved blade and its weighted head, it gave a cut nearly as deep as the war sword. Rather surprisingly, the early Norman-Saxon type sword and the late 15th century sword were pretty similar, almost identical in the thrust. And that is surprising because this one has a rounded point and this one has a very sharp needle point. They also performed fairly similarly in the cut. So we have two swords here separated by 500 years, and they're performing in pretty much the same way. And I think that's what I've learned from this. People were looking for solutions. They were looking for new designs, new ways to defeat armor. Craftsmen were experimenting. But ultimately, a sword is an iron bar with a sharp edge and a point, and it's going to behave in a very similar way. Marcello does a couple of jabs for my face, but it's not only the edge and the point that do the work. As well as wrestling and disarming techniques, Talhofer shows us how to use the whole sword as a weapon. This is no-holds-barred fighting. Now I can swing the crossguard over for his head, what Talhofer calls the murder stroke. Pull his sword out of his hand, go for his face with my pommel. However, I have now made myself vulnerable, because there's something else you can do with the sword. You can use the crossguard as a hook. The students now have a repertoire of techniques. The next step is to get them all fighting at once in the confusion of a battle scene.
I think when you're in the middle of these battles, I think, yeah, it could be quite frightening. Obviously, us doing it, it's been choreographed and we kind of know what we're going to be doing, but there's still that sense of danger and there's still swords. At the moment, there's only about 10 of us in here. If you imagine thousands of people on a battlefield, it must have been crazy and very scary indeed. You're having swords coming at all angles. At the moment, we're just having them coming sort of with just one partner. But if you imagine, say you're fighting someone there, you're going to have about 3 people coming from behind you. So yeah, I can imagine it probably is quite scary.
The fighting at Barnet was fierce, with men enduring an incessant torrent of crushing, clubbing and battering blows. Yet after 3 hours, the battle showed no signs of stopping. Until, that is, an incident of friendly fire involving these 2 flags broke the deadlock. 530 years ago, the fighting at Barnet was well underway. It was hand-to-hand combat, an arduous, grunting labour of battle in which the sword was the most prominent weapon. Many of the soldiers were fighting in plate armour. But how difficult is this? And how long could a soldier last? One of my sword school students has volunteered to find out. Lockhart's going to fight continuously against 3 adversaries. The clock stops when he becomes so tired he can no longer defend himself. In battle, he would then be a dead man. Here's your sword. Here's your first opponent. Stand by for my word. I'm going to be timing this. And go! And up. Placing each blow requires a consistent level of effort. It's an experience similar to being in a boxing ring. But while a round lasts 3 minutes, the Battle of Barnet lasted for at least 3 hours. You're right, okay. You get some air. You get some air. Is that a bit warm in there? Yeah. Is it hurting?
Yeah.
You did 2 minutes 16. Are you disappointed with that, or quite? Yeah. I think the soldiers at Barnet must have used some sort of relay system, a buddy system, where they constantly took turn and turn about in the thick of the fighting. You're a fit young man. No. 3 hours, no. 20 minutes, no. 5 minutes, possibly, if you're super fit and you're used to wearing this stuff. Yeah. But you think if you were able to get a little bit of a breather in between, that would have made a big difference?
I reckon, yeah, definitely. If you just start time to settle yourself and then go again, then go again. But with that, I found it was just constantly 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, which was hard. Yeah.
You did well. Let's get you some water.
Cool.
So we've looked at some of the basic principles of fighting with a longsword, Talhoffer's principles. But he is only showing us in single combat. Nothing can prepare you for the maelstrom of battle, for that chaos of fighting in the fog. But let's have a go. I want you all fighting at once. Some of you will finish a fight and others will come on to you. We're going to be really having to react very quickly to changing situations. Of course it won't be anything like the horrific real experience of war, but it will give you an idea of the dynamics of a medieval battlefield. Go to first positions, let battle commence. The thick fog at Barnet meant men could only fight with handheld weapons. And the sword, once the elite weapon of Saxon warriors, still held sway in the hands of soldiers of all ranks. Against plate armor, its heavy, percussive blows could cause fractured limbs, severe hemorrhaging, concussion, and the loss of orientation, resulting in men removed from the fighting in a dazed and confused state. But there was death at Barnet. As many as 5,000 men are thought to have died. And the sword could kill outright with a driving thrust into the face, as men lifted their visors to see and breathe in the chaos of battle. After 3 hours of fighting, Warwick believed the day was almost his, and was just waiting for the return of his ally, the Earl of Oxford, to seal his victory. Oxford's men were already in the town of Barnet, plundering and looting. But with a remarkable act of leadership, he rallied 800 of them and led them up the Great North Road back to the battlefield. But disaster struck. In the thick fog, Warwick's archers mistook Oxford's standard, a star, with the enemy flag, a sun. And in a tragic incident of friendly fire, Oxford's men began to fall under a hail of arrows. It was a mistake that turned the tide of battle. Having unintentionally killed men on their own side, Warwick's entire force was overtaken by confusion and hysteria. Thousands quit the battlefield, believing they'd been betrayed. Warwick realized that all was lost, and after seeing his brother Montague killed before him, he decided to flee the battlefield. It had been his brother's idea to send his horse behind the lines, to show those that followed him that he was not for turning, that he would fight till the end. But now, weighed by his armor, after hours of exhausting fighting, he struggled through the fog and carnage to make his escape. It is thought he might have reached his horse, but he was trapped in the woods, where he was captured. Warwick, the kingmaker, the most powerful man in England, was then killed and stripped naked. His corpse subsequently taken to London for ignominious display before the gawping crowds. Edward wins again at Tewkesbury a few weeks later, mopping up the last of the Lancastrian resistance. He reigns unchallenged until he dies 12 years later. The sword had gone on a long journey, from the elite weapon of Saxon heroes to the universal weapon of last resort, and an everlasting symbol of war. The power of the sword endured. In spite of the increased use of gunpowder in the following centuries, it remained at the heart of military identity, constantly reinventing itself for infantry and cavalry. It was the ubiquitous sidearm for all troops right until the end of the 19th century, and it remains today as the principal emblem of an officer's rank. No other weapon carries with it such ancestral authority and potent magic.